So you've brushed your teeth. Hopefully, you're under your blanket. Maybe the fan is humming above you. And you've chosen to spend your precious few minutes of calm not with true crime, not with fast cars or clever documentaries, but with me, talking about why medieval people thought burning off their hairline was the height of elegance. Yes, this is your life now, and honestly, it's mine too. Let's set the mood. The Middle Ages, roughly between the 5th and 15th century. Castles, muddy villages, monks copying texts by candlelight, and kings pretending they were cleaner than everyone else while still smelling faintly like horse and onions. And in all of that, in the midst of plague, poor harvests, and wars that never seemed to end, people still found time to obsess over beauty standards. Because apparently, even when you're worried about the Black Death knocking on your door, you also need to make sure your forehead looks just so. Now to us, medieval portraits look flat, stiff, almost comical. Big round eyes, long noses, faces pale as chalk, with strange hats or veils like folded linen pancakes. But to them, this was aspirational. This was the medieval equivalent of photoshopped Instagram filters. You weren't just born pretty, you had to work at it. And by work, I mean sometimes literally poisoning yourself with lead or plucking out perfectly good eyebrows until your forehead looked like a stretched sail. But let's not rush. Tonight, we're going to go slowly, wandering through these beauty standards as if through a dimly lit hall of tapestries. Imagine a candle flickering, illuminating the pale painted faces of noble ladies. The air smells faintly of beeswax, wool, and damp stone. Outside, rain patters against a castle window. And here you are, peeking into their world where beauty meant suffering, vanity meant strange rituals, and fashion could make you look ridiculous by modern standards. But oh, how they thought they looked divine. Let's start with the forehead. Because yes, of all things, the medieval world really cared about foreheads. Today, you might think, I don't notice foreheads unless they're unusually large. But back then, the higher your forehead, the more elegant and noble you appeared. This wasn't just a passing phase either, it lasted centuries. So what did women do? They plucked their hairlines back. Imagine standing with a little iron tweezer, tugging away strand after strand to reveal more skin. Some didn't stop there. They actually used caustic chemicals, mixtures of vinegar and walnut oil or even quicklime to burn the hair follicles so nothing would grow back. The goal was to create a vast, shining dome of forehead that screamed refinement. And to us, it screams alien. But here's the kicker. This wasn't only for looks. A high forehead symbolized intelligence and status. People thought it made you resemble classical statues of Roman goddesses. And since medieval elites were obsessed with connecting themselves to Rome, they'd endure anything to look the part. So, as they plucked, burned, and scraped their hairlines away, they believed they were ascending closer to Venus or Minerva. Instead, they looked like eggs in veils. Still, nobody laughed, because when all the noble women around you are doing it, and the painters flatter it in your portrait, suddenly the bizarre becomes the norm. Beauty, after all, is just collective delusion in a nice frame. Let's pause here and picture it. A dim castle chamber, a lady seated by the hearth, her maid pulling at her hairline with tweezers. The lady winces but keeps her chin high. A polished bronze mirror leans nearby, reflecting the growing expanse of pale skin above her brows. She nods approvingly. Soon she'll be admired at court for her elegance. Meanwhile, you and I are thinking, Madam, you've just given yourself the world's worst receding hairline on purpose. But we're in the future, they were. To them, this was glamour. Now, beauty was never just one feature. The forehead may have been prized, but it had to work in harmony with the skin. And oh, medieval skin ideals, this is where it gets delightfully dangerous. But before we move fully into the poisons, let's linger in this first room of our story. Because I want you to imagine the setting more vividly. Torches flickering against rough stone, the echo of footsteps in a drafty corridor, a hall where tapestries show hunting scenes while real rats scuttle behind them. And amidst this mix of grandeur and grime, people obsessed over tiny details of appearance. In some ways, it's reassuring. Human beings have always been shallow. In other ways, it's tragic, because vanity mixed with ignorance leads to a lot of suffering. The forehead was plucked, the brows thinned or erased, the eyes lined with soot for contrast. And already you begin to see a pattern. Medieval beauty wasn't natural. It was effort, ritual, a kind of body modification done slowly and painfully. And while some peasants may have laughed at it, the nobility embraced it wholeheartedly. After all, what's the point of wealth and leisure if not to spend hours mutilating your scalp for fashion, skin like parchment? So now that we've admired the medieval forehead, let's float down a little, right into the face itself. Because if the forehead was a grand canvas, the skin had to be the parchment upon which nobility wrote their status. And by parchment, I do mean pale, flat, nearly colorless, as if you've just crawled out of the crypt. Today we think of glowing skin, bronzed complexions, beach tans, thank you, 20th century. But in the Middle Ages, oh no, if you looked sun-kissed it meant you were working outside. And if you were working outside you were probably a peasant. And if you were a peasant, well, nobody wanted to look like you. So nobility went the opposite direction. They wanted skin so pale it bordered on translucent. If someone could see the veins under your skin, congratulations, you were officially elite. But here, the problem. The human body isn't naturally corpse pale unless you're sick. So, of course, people got creative. Let's open the medieval beauty cabinet. Inside, we find a terrifying little collection of powders, ointments, and concoctions. The star ingredient? Lead. Yes, the same toxic substance we now spend billions removing from paint and pipes. Medieval people happily smeared on their faces. White lead paste was the ultimate whitening cream. It gave skin a smooth, ghostly appearance, covered blemishes, and made you glow, or at least, glow in a way that foreshadowed your eventual slow poisoning. Some recipes mixed lead with vinegar, creating what was basically a face-eating acid. Others blended it with egg whites or honey, trying to keep it from flacking. And if lead wasn't enough, there was always mercury. Imagine gently painting your cheeks with poison every morning, and then wondering why your teeth fell out, your hair thinned. Or your mood swung wildly, but at least you looked radiant while it lasted. Now, to be fair, not everyone was slathering themselves in heavy metals daily. Some ladies of the court used more natural methods, bathing their faces in milk, rubbing herbs like rosemary or sage, or applying a thin dusting of ground rice. Still, the gold standard of noble beauty was bone-white skin, and the fastest way to achieve it was, well, let's just call it medieval Sephora with a side of slow death. Of course, there were warnings. Some physicians muttered about the dangers of lead. A few moralists even claimed that altering your face was sinful vanity. But nobility shrugged. When your job description was sit in halls, arrange marriages, and look desirable at banquets, appearance mattered more than longevity. Now, pale skin wasn't just cosmetic. It had layers of symbolism. Christianity valued purity, and whiteness of skin was equated with spiritual purity. Artists painted saints with luminous pale faces, and nobles copied it eagerly. A pale face wasn't just beautiful, it was virtuous, or so they told themselves. Picture it, a banquet hall, torches flickering, music from lutes drifting lazily. A noblewoman glides in, her forehead a shining dome, her skin so white it nearly reflects the candlelight. People murmur approvingly. She looks untouchable, elevated, wholly even. No one whispers about the rash beneath the powder, or the fact that she's been coughing for weeks. Beauty was performance, and the performance demanded sacrifice. And let's not forget the men. Yes, men also partook in these beauty ideals. A smooth, pale complexion signaled that a knight or courtier was of noble birth, not someone who'd been out farming. They didn't usually go as far with makeup, but some absolutely dabbled in powders, face washes, and even light rouge. After all, if your lady looked ethereal and you looked like a weathered turnip, people might talk. Now, if pale skin was ideal, blemishes were the great enemy. Pimples, freckles, scars, these were disasters. Remedies abounded. One popular cure for pimples was a paste made of pigeon droppings mixed with vinegar. Yes, really. Freckles could be bleached with a wash of lemon juice and sulfur. Scars might be rubbed with goose fat or snail slime. If it sounds disgusting, that's because it was. But desperation makes strange ointments seem reasonable. Let's pause here for a cozy image. Imagine a noblewoman before bed. Her maid brings a small earthenware bowl. Inside is a mixture of egg whites, honey, and lead powder. The lady reclines on a carved wooden chair, her hair wrapped in linen, while her maid gently smooths the paste onto her face. The fire crackles. Outside, wolves howl in the distance. But inside, the focus is on transforming a living face into the smooth blankness of ivory. The irony, of course, is that many of these beauty routines made skin worse. Lead caused sores, mercury reddened and inflamed, acids burned. But since everyone was suffering together, the pain just blended into normal life. And if you were lucky enough to live long enough to see your skin rot from cosmetics, at least you'd already married into a good alliance. Priorities. Let's also talk about lips and cheeks. A pale face didn't mean no color at all. The medieval ideal was a soft blush, delicate, controlled, nothing like modern lipstick. They used crushed berries, red ochre, even wine sediment to tint the lips. Cheeks could be dabbed with a touch of saffron or madder root for that I'm healthy, not dying of plague look. It was a careful balance. Too much color, and you looked like a lowly actress or prostitute. Too little, and you looked like an actual corpse. And so, every day, noble faces became canvases. Pale skin, faint blush, thin brows, high foreheads. A look both ethereal and faintly uncanny. If you've ever looked at a medieval portrait and thought, they look half dead, well, yes, that was the point. But to the medieval eye, this wasn't macabre. It was refinement. Pale meant noble, smooth meant pure, controlled blush meant wealth. A woman's body was a statement of her family's status, and her face was the gilded manuscript cover advertising their power, hair like a medieval crown. So we floated across the vast forehead and the ghostly pale skin, and now it's time to move a little higher, back to the hair that wasn't entirely plucked away. Because while the medieval forehead was meant to be grand and empty, the rest of the hair was treated like a crown. And oh, the lengths people went to for their locks. In theory, hair should have been simple. Grow it, wash it occasionally, braid it neatly, cover it with a veil or hood, done. But of course, it wasn't that simple. Hair was another battlefield of symbolism. It had to reflect status, virtue, wealth, and sometimes even piety. And it had to do all of this while still surviving medieval shampoo, which was basically lye soap and rosemary water. Let's begin with length. For noblewomen, long hair was prized. The longer, the better. It was a symbol of femininity, youth, and fertility. Loose hair was only acceptable for young unmarried women or for brides on their wedding day. A married woman with her hair down in public, scandalous. Once you tied the knot, you also tied up your hair. It was a kind of visual chastity belt. So how did they style it? Braids, twists, buns, often hidden under elaborate headdresses. But these weren't simple braids. Think thick ropes of hair coiled around the ears, sometimes padded out with wool or fake hairpieces. Yes, medieval extensions were a thing. If your hair was thin, you could buy locks from peasants who sold their hair for extra coin. And then you'd weave it into your own to create a glorious halo of braids. Color mattered too. Blonde was especially prized. In fact, in much of Europe, blonde was considered the ideal of beauty. Fair hair paired with pale skin, the ultimate package. Brunettes weren't excluded, but poems, romances, and courtly love songs all swooned over golden-haired maidens. If you weren't naturally blonde, well, there were solutions. And by solutions, I mean dangerous home chemistry experiments. One popular recipe for hair lightening involved a mix of saffron, alum, and stale urine. Yes, you heard correctly. Women would soak their hair in this, then sit in the sun for hours, baking the mixture into their strands until they achieved a faintly golden hue. You can imagine the smell. But fashion requires sacrifice, and apparently olfactory dignity was optional. Now, hairstyles themselves became increasingly bizarre in the late Middle Ages. One of the most infamous was the hennin, those towering conical hats that look like unicorn horns. Usually wrapped in silk, sometimes with a veil streaming from the tip, they turned women into walking architecture. To fit under them, hair was braided tightly and hidden, or wound into side buns that stuck out like little ears. The hennin was impractical, ridiculous, and utterly beloved by noblewomen desperate to show off their status. The taller the hennin, the higher your rank, or at least your vanity. Of course, not everyone admired these styles. Moralists, monks, and preachers ranted endlessly about female vanity. A tall hennin was basically a neon sign that said, "This woman has too much time and money." Satirical poems mocked women whose hair arrangements looked like horns, accusing them of devilish pride. But did that stop anyone? Not at all. If anything, it probably made them taller. Now let's not leave the men out. Male hairstyles varied with fashion, but they also leaned toward the ridiculous. At certain points, men favored long flowing locks, carefully curled, sometimes even bleached with the same urine and herb concoctions. At other times, the bowl cut reigned supreme, a literal blunt line around the head, the same style we still associate with unfortunate toddlers. Knights were often depicted with long hair streaming out of their helmets, but in reality, many cropped it short for practicality. Still, at court, hair was as much a part of fashion as clothing. Let's pause for a moment to picture the daily ritual. A noblewoman sits before a polished bronze mirror. Her maid combs out her hair with a wooden comb, tugging at knots while the lady winces. A pot of saffron paste sits nearby, ready to brighten her locks. Outside, the sun is shining, and soon she'll be perched by the window, hair spread wide, letting the mixture bake in the light. Down the hall, her husband paces, complaining that her hennin keeps hitting him in the face at dinner. This is medieval glamour. But hair wasn't just fashion. It carried moral and symbolic weight. Loose hair meant youth and sensuality. Covered hair meant chastity and respectability. To uncover your hair in public as a married woman could be interpreted as shameful, even provocative. In art, Mary the Virgin is almost always shown veiled, while Mary Magdalene is shown with flowing hair, pure versus sensual, in visual code. And then there's the ultimate irony. While nobles fussed over their hair, most peasants simply tied it back and got on with life. No hennins, no saffron paste, no towering veils, just practical braids and kerchiefs to keep lice at bay. The peasants may not have looked glamorous, but they also weren't walking around smelling like ammonia from hair dye experiments. By the late 15th century, hairstyles reached absurd new heights, literally. Women patted out their side buns with cloth until they looked like animal ears, then balanced veils over them. Portraits from Burgundy and France show ladies with towering, geometric headdresses that seem better suited to supporting scaffolding than attending court. But that's the nature of fashion. Take something simple, exaggerate it, double down, then look ridiculous while insisting you're chic. Let's float here for a moment in a great hall. A row of noblewomen sit in carved wooden chairs, their hennins rising like spires, their veils trailing to the floor. Their hair is tightly braided beneath, unseen but essential. They gossip quietly, comparing which saffron paste worked best, which maid scorched the hair least in the sun. To us, they look like otherworldly beings, equal parts elegant and absurd. To them, they were radiant, desirable, untouchable. And so hair became not just hair, but a crown, a symbol, a statement. The peasants might laugh, the priests might scold, the husbands might grumble, but the ladies persisted. Because in every era, beauty demands devotion, even if it means bleaching your scalp with herbs and urine. Bodies, corsets, and ideal figures. So far, we've floated past foreheads, drifted across pale faces, and tangled ourselves in hennins and saffron hair dye. But now we arrive at the body. And if you thought faces were a battlefield of strange ideals, wait until you see how the medieval world imagined the perfect figure. Spoiler: it wasn't gym-sculpted abs or Instagram curves. No, this was something much more parchment flat. Let's begin with proportions. The medieval female ideal was not voluptuous. Forget the Renaissance for a moment, with Rubens painting fleshy goddesses lounging on clouds. In the earlier Middle Ages, beauty was slender, narrow, almost fragile. Writers praised women with small waists, modest busts, and hips that didn't exactly scream childbearing. A long, thin body was considered elegant. Think less hourglass, more elongated candle. And yet, paradoxically, women were supposed to look fertile and healthy. So there had to be just enough softness, rosy cheeks, slight curves, to suggest vitality. Too much flesh and you were mocked for gluttony. Too little and you looked ill, which wasn't a great look even in plague years. The line was razor thin. Clothing, of course, helped shape this ideal. Enter the corset's medieval ancestors. They weren't quite the bone-crushing devices of the 18th century, but women did wear fitted gowns with stiffened bodices, sometimes laced so tightly they created a narrow, tube-like figure. Add to that long sleeves, trailing skirts, and layered fabrics, and you had the illusion of a tall, slim silhouette. The body underneath was almost irrelevant. The fashion did the sculpting. Now let's imagine the daily reality. A noblewoman stands before her maid. The maid pulls a long lace at the back of her gown, tightening it around the ribs. The woman holds her breath. The bodice stiffens her torso into a smooth line. She exhales carefully, knowing she'll be half strangled at the banquet later, but at least admired for her elegant form. Meanwhile, a peasant in the village is free to breathe, eat, and bend over her work without fainting. But of course, peasants weren't expected to look like saints in stained glass. Speaking of stained glass, art shaped these ideals as much as clothing did. If you wander through medieval churches, or, let's be honest, flip through a coffee table book, you'll see female saints and noble donors depicted tall, slim, with impossibly long fingers and small heads. Artists weren't striving for realism. They were flattening and stretching the human form into symbols of grace. And since art was what people aspired to, real bodies had to imitate the painted fantasy. Now let's talk busts. A full chest was not the ideal. In fact, small breasts were often praised as more virtuous and youthful. Large busts, by contrast, were associated with lust, immodesty, and lower-class women. This isn't to say medieval men didn't enjoy them, but the cultural ideal leaned firmly toward modesty. Some gowns even compressed the chest deliberately, flattening it into a smooth plane. Imagine spending centuries being told your body was morally suspicious simply because you had curves. Charming. The waist was more complicated. A narrow waist was admired. But it wasn't measured with obsessive precision the way Victorians later did. It was more about the overall silhouette. The body should flow in a long, unbroken line. Hips were minimized. Bell-shaped skirts helped obscure natural curves, creating the impression of a slim tower rising from the floor. For men, the ideals were equally strange. A nobleman was expected to be strong, yes, but not bulky. Lean, tall, with broad shoulders tapering to a narrow waist. Knights in poetry were described as graceful as much as powerful, their bodies elegant in armor. A beer belly did not make you chivalric, though of course plenty of kings acquired one anyway. Let's float into a castle feast for a moment. Long trestle tables are laden with roasted meats, pies, flagons of ale. Servants dart back and forth. Musicians strum lutes in the corner. At the high table, noblemen sit straight-backed, their waists cinched in doublets, their legs sheathed in tight hose that leave nothing to the imagination. Beside them, noble women in stiff bodices sip delicately, trying not to undo their laces with every swallow. Everyone is uncomfortable, but everyone looks fabulous, at least by their standards. Pregnancy, of course, complicated things. Noble women were expected to produce heirs, and that meant visible bumps. Fashion adapted. Some gowns were looser, allowing room for pregnancy without fully revealing it. In portraits, women are often shown slim even when known to have been mothers many times over. The body was edited, idealized long before Photoshop. Now diet also played into body ideals. Nobility had access to rich food, but moderation was praised. Gluttony was a sin, after all. Corpulence could signal wealth, but too much of it was frowned upon, especially for women. A lady should look refined, not like she devoured half the larder. This tension between abundance and restraint shaped how bodies were viewed. Eat the peacock pie, yes, but make sure you still look slim under your velvet gown. Exercise wasn't part of the program, at least not as we think of it. Noblewomen might ride horses, play games like lawn bowling, or dance in stately circles, but nothing designed to tone muscles. Nobility didn't sweat, at least not in public. A soft, delicate body suggested you weren't burdened with labor. For men, tournaments and hunts provided activity, but again, the look was lean grace, not brute muscle. Let's take another cozy moment. Picture a noblewoman's morning. She's in her chamber, a tapestry of unicorns and hunters on the wall. Her maid brings a stiffened gown. They lace her in, smoothing fabric over her torso until she looks impossibly narrow. She sighs, adjusts her veil, and checks her reflection in a polished mirror. Does she look slim enough, pale enough, elegant enough? Satisfied, she prepares to descend to the hall, where everyone else will be similarly bound and powdered, pretending that this is comfortable. The irony, of course, is that bodies in reality came in all shapes and sizes. Medieval people weren't aliens. Some were tall, some short, some slim, some stout. But ideals are rarely about reality. They're about control. The noble body was not just flesh. It It was a performance of status, discipline, and virtue. And so, even if it meant discomfort, nobles shaped themselves into long, narrow silhouettes while peasants laughed and carried on with practical bodies built by labor. And so, part 4 drifts to a close with this image. A hall filled with slender silhouettes, stiff bodices, narrow waists, small busts, and veiled heads. The music of lutes drifts softly. Everyone looks ethereal, otherworldly, elegant. To them, it is beauty. To us, it looks like a collective decision to suffocate in velvet tubes. But beauty, as always, is pain, and in this case also indigestion. The smell of beauty. Baths, perfumes, and hygiene myths. When we imagine the Middle Ages, one myth wafts into the air almost as stubbornly as garlic on breath. That everyone stank. Filthy peasants, unwashed nobles, castles reeking of sewage. It's an image Hollywood loves. But the truth is subtler. Hygiene mattered, not just for health but for beauty. And yet, medieval beauty standards often clashed with reality in strange, fragrant, and sometimes foul ways. Let's begin with baths. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people did bathe. Public bathhouses were common in towns across Europe. Imagine large wooden tubs, steaming with hot water, shared by men and women, sometimes scandalously so. In some cities, bathhouses doubled as social hubs, places to eat, drink, gossip, and occasionally indulge in activities that went far beyond soap and scrubbing. But bathhouses fell under suspicion. The church often frowned on them as dens of sin. Disease outbreaks, too, cast them in a bad light. During the Black Death, some even claimed that bathing opened the pores, allowing plague to enter the body. The result? By the later Middle Ages, bathing fell out of favor in many places, especially among elites. Still, cleanliness remained a beauty ideal. If you couldn't bathe often, you improvised. Nobles wiped themselves with linen cloths soaked in rose water or vinegar. They washed their hands before and after meals. They rinsed their faces in scented water every morning. And of course, they masked odors with perfumes. Perfume was big business. Distillation techniques from the Islamic world brought rose water, jasmine, and musk into European courts. Nobles wore pomanders, small, perforated balls filled with herbs and spices, dangling from chains or tucked into clothing. A lady might carry the sweet tang of cloves or ambergris as she walked through a hall, her fragrance signaling refinement as much as her silk gown. Now teeth. White teeth were admired, though dentistry was primitive. People rubbed them with cloths dipped in sage or salt, or chewed aromatic herbs to freshen breath. Bad breath was more than unpleasant, it was morally suspect. Writers mocked characters with foul mouths as coarse or sinful. Beauty meant not only looking elegant but smelling pleasant, at least from a respectable distance. Hair hygiene was another ordeal. Washing with water wasn't always frequent, but people combed obsessively. Lice combs, carved from bone or wood, are common archaeological finds. Hair was sprinkled with powders, made of orris root, ground herbs, or even crushed flowers, to keep it fresh. Imagine a noblewoman's braid dusted with lavender, both fragrant and symbolic of her status. And then there were sweat cures. Sweating was thought to expel impurities. Wealthy households had sweat baths, like primitive saunas, where people sat wrapped in cloths over hot stones, dripping toxins away. A flushed, glowing complexion was praised, provided it didn't cross into feverish blotches. But odors weren't only personal. Homes reeked too. Straw on floors soaked up everything from spilled ale to chamber pot accidents. To combat this, herbs were strewn across floors: mint, thyme, lavender. With every footstep, a pleasant aroma was released, masking the less charming smells. Beauty wasn't just skin deep, it extended to the environment around you. Now picture a banquet again. Before guests arrive, servants scatter rose petals and fresh rushes on the hall floor. Candles burn with scented wax. Musicians tune their lutes. At the high table, nobles dab wrists with civet or musk. The hall smells rich, layered, intoxicating. Step outside, though, and you're back to horse dung and muddy streets. The contrast must have been staggering. Hygiene rituals also carried symbolic weight. Washing before meals wasn't only about removing dirt, it was about purity. A lord might have a servant pour scented water over his hands into a silver basin, while a lady dabbed her fingers delicately. These gestures were theatrical, reminders that cleanliness and civility went hand in hand. Yet we shouldn't romanticize too much. Even with perfumes and powders, medieval life smelled different than today. Smoke from hearth fires clung to clothing. Animal dung lingered in streets. Chamber pots were emptied into open gutters. Beauty had to fight against a stubborn background of odor. To be fragrant was an achievement, one that required wealth, effort, and constant maintenance. And then there's the strange paradox. Pale skin was prized, yet soap often contained harsh ingredients that irritated or darkened it. Remedies for odor sometimes backfired. Some perfumes, heavy with musk or civet, could be overwhelming. Imagine being trapped in a crowded hall, everyone competing to outscent each other until the air was thick enough to choke on. For peasants, hygiene was simpler. A river served as bathtub, laundry station, and fishery all at once. Soapwort, a natural foaming plant, sometimes substituted for costly soaps. Cleanliness mattered here too, but it wasn't tied to ideals of elegance, it was survival. Peasants needed to wash dirt and sweat just to keep functioning. Beauty rituals were a luxury of the elite. Now let's zoom into a private moment. A noblewoman sits in her chamber. Before her, a basin of rose water. She dips a cloth, wrings it out, and gently wipes her face. A maid powders her hair with orris root, the scent rising like violets. She opens a carved wooden box, lifts a pomander, and slips it into her sleeve. In that moment, she's not just clean, she's radiant, fragrant, beautiful. Her beauty is layered, a performance stitched from sight and scent alike. The irony, all this effort didn't always work. Chronic diseases, dental issues, lice, and body odor were part of medieval life no matter how noble you were. But beauty standards are about aspiration, not reality. To smell of roses in a world of dung was to declare, I am above the muck, I am refined, I am closer to heaven. Cosmetics, paint, and the dangerous pursuit of beauty. We've wandered through pale skin, plucked hairlines, shimmering clothes, and the sweet haze of perfumes. But medieval beauty had one last frontier, cosmetics. And like many things in history, the pursuit of beauty often came at a cost, sometimes toxic, sometimes fatal, but always fashionable. Let's begin with the face, because in a world without Instagram filters, paint had to do the work. Pale skin was the foundation of the ideal look. If your natural complexion leaned toward healthy tan from outdoor work, well, that marked you as a peasant. Nobles wanted skin so light it looked like marble, and if you weren't naturally pale, you could fake it. One method was lead-based makeup. Yes, lead. White lead powders and creams were applied to the face to create that ghostly, porcelain glow. Never mind that lead was poisonous, caused skin damage, and eventually disfigured the very face it was supposed to beautify. When your ideal was fragile and ethereal, the risk apparently felt worth it. Other recipes for whitening creams included vinegar mixed with powdered bone, chalk, or even ground eggshells. Imagine standing in front of a polished metal mirror, dabbing this chalky paste across your cheeks, hoping it dries evenly. No contouring kits here, just flat, pale surfaces like a human parchment page. Rouge was another favorite. After whitening the face, a dash of red was added to lips or cheeks to suggest vitality. Recipes varied wildly. Some used crushed cochineal beetles, imported at great cost. Others relied on red roots, berries, or even wine sediment. Applied lightly, it gave a healthy flush. Applied heavily, it turned the wearer into what moralists mocked as a painted doll. Eyebrows and eyelashes weren't heavily emphasized, but darkening them occasionally cropped up. Some women used soot mixed with oil. Others simply left them thin or shaved to exaggerate the towering forehead. Beauty was selective. It highlighted what culture admired most and erased what it didn't. And then, the strangest detail. Women sometimes painted veins on their temples with blue dye to enhance the illusion of translucent, delicate skin. Nothing said noble and refined, like looking one fainting spell away from collapse. But the real danger was mercury. Mercury-based concoctions promised to banish blemishes, smooth the skin, and brighten the face. In reality, they poisoned the body, eroded the skin, and sometimes led to neurological damage. Still, people persisted. Better to suffer invisibly than to be seen as coarse. Lip balms, too, had their quirks. Wax mixed with herbs could tint the lips. Honey sometimes doubled as gloss, though it had the unfortunate habit of attracting flies. Perfumed oils were rubbed on cheeks for shine. The goal was not realism but symbolism. You weren't supposed to look natural. You were supposed to look elevated, otherworldly. And it wasn't just women. Men dabbled as well. Knights heading into tournaments sometimes rouged their cheeks for extra color. Courtly fashion demanded polish, and while men didn't go for lead-white faces, they too leaned on scented oils, hair powders, and even the occasional face wash made of herbs and wine. Of course, not everyone approved. Preachers railed against cosmetics as deceitful. To paint your face, they warned, was to mask God's creation. Writers mocked women who overdid it, calling them vain, shallow, or sinful. But moral disapproval never really stopped anyone. If anything, it probably made cosmetics more alluring. Cosmetics were also social markers. Recipes varied depending on wealth. A noblewoman could afford imported pigments, distillations, and apothecary jars. A merchant's wife might use homemade pastes of herbs and chalk. A peasant, likely nothing more than a bit of berry juice in summer. Makeup wasn't just about beauty, it was about class performance. Imagine a lady of court preparing for a feast. First, she wipes her face with rose water. Then a maid applies whitening cream, careful not to smear. Rouge dots her cheeks, faint at first, then blended with a fingertip. Lips tinted with a red balm. Hair powdered, fragrant with lavender. The lady adjusts her silk veil, glances in her polished mirror, and smiles. When she enters the hall, she glows, not because she's healthy, but because she has mastered the look of fragility and refinement. Now imagine the long-term cost. After years of applying lead paste, her skin cracks, eruptions form, and wrinkles deepen. The very tool of beauty becomes the agent of decay. Yet even then, many doubled down, covering damage with more paint. It's the medieval version of a filter gone wrong, beauty standards chasing themselves into self-destruction. The fascination with painted faces was not uniquely European. In the Islamic world, kohl was used for eyes. In East Asia, white powders and rouge shaped courtly aesthetics. Beauty rituals spanned cultures, though each region had its own ideals. What unites them is the same paradox. People wanted to transcend nature, even if it meant courting danger. And here's the irony to float on. The natural look was never natural. Pale faces, painted veins, and bee-stung lips were manufactured performances. The goal was not authenticity, but illusion, an illusion convincing enough to uphold the fragile world of status and beauty. As the medieval centuries closed and the Renaissance dawned, many of these standards lingered. Paleness remained prized, rouge endured, and dangerous powders stayed in circulation. Even centuries later, noblewomen would still poison themselves in the name of beauty, chasing that fleeting, delicate perfection. So we end with an image, a candlelit chamber, a lady before her mirror, a maid dabbing white paste across her cheeks, rouge brightening her lips, perfumed oil brushed on her temples. She looks serene, almost saintly, as if beauty were a prayer. But beneath the glow lies poison. Beneath the illusion lies the cost. That is the strange, sleepy truth of medieval cosmetics. They were both art and alchemy, grace and danger. Beauty standards that promised heaven, but often delivered a little taste of hell.